So, Bob, you showed that famous diagram, right, where you designed this Ethernet. I remember having worked for a few years at Xerox. When I visited Xerox Park, saw that diagram, and it was just awe-inspiring, right? You were asked to connect these personal computers, and in the process, you ended up inventing the Ethernet. And I have a feeling you didn't realize how big that was going to be at that time. So my question was, what were some of the, I guess, factors that went into making that so successful?
Then there was, when we brought Ethernet to market, and I can explain how, if you're interested, how we did this, but we ran into trouble with the antitrust division of the United States government. So we had to promise that the network we were designing was going to be an open standard. And that was very important. So IBM, which was by then the entire computer industry, saw Ethernet getting attraction, that customers liked the idea of a multi-vendor standard. And so IBM invaded the IEEE committee making the standard. And so we went head to head with IBM for a year. Imagine going to work every day for 10 years with your wife and your team and your investors and your customers all telling you that IBM is going to kill you. But they didn't. We beat them. And so that was another factor, was sincerity. We were sincerely aiming to be a multi-vendor standard, and IBM did not understand that. So they said, hey, we have a standard too. So then my company shipped IBM Token Ring ahead of IBM, and we couldn't sell it because that card we made plugged into a big network architecture that IBM had, and we didn't have access to that. So they had 95% market share on their Token Ring card. So sincerity of standardization was a factor. Ethernet is also a cool design, whoever those guys were. And it was cheaper, faster than IBM Token Ring.
I was also curious. I mean, there are some amazing innovations that came out of Xerox PARC. Could you tell us a little bit about what that environment was like, and what was it, right, that led to so many of these things coming out? The graphical user interface, the Ethernet, object-oriented programming, you name it. I mean, there were so many.
I think the secret was Robert W. Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, who had run computer science research out of ARPA for a few years. And he knew all the computer scientists in the world because they all came to him to get money. And then Xerox recruited him to create the computer science lab. And he knew all the people in computer science, including me. He knew me. And so I got to go. And so I think that was part of the magic, was you had Bob Taylor, picking people, and he knew them all. Because they all begged him for money for years on end. Another thing that helped is that Xerox at that time was a monopoly. Xerox invented the copier. And they were selling them at a very high price because they had no competition, because they had patents. So we had all the money we needed. There was no shortage of money. We flew first class. The computer scientists at the Xerox Research Center flew first class in planes. That's why I went there.
And I guess the freedom to work on and being challenged to work on ambitious problems. And
so Bob Taylor had a series of principles that moved our lab close to being a university lab that he instilled. So for example, when my hostile colleague came up with XNet, it was Bob Taylor who went and made him stop. So I went to thank Bob Taylor, and he denied that he stopped that competing. He denied it. He didn't want it generally known that he had intervened because his principles of management wouldn't support that. But this was such an egregious case that he made an exception. Told him to stop.
So they say prediction is hard, especially of the future. And you've made many predictions that came true, but some that didn't. You were quite concerned about the internet, the way the internet was growing, and kind of was concerned Was it, I mean, was it like you just underestimated brilliance of your own invention and so on? So what was it that led to internet, right, thriving a lot more?
Then I went to the World Wide Web conference in Santa Clara and said this to 1,000 bloodthirsty webmasters. And they made me promise that if I was wrong, that I would eat my column. So I foolishly agreed to this. And 1996 came, and the internet did not collapse during 1996. So I went back to the World Wide Web conference in 97, and I began my talk there by explaining that I was close enough. My prediction was close enough. The audience booed, and they were not getting that. So then I said, and I pulled out a cake, the shape of my column, and I started cutting it and eating it, and all eating the column together. They didn't go for that either. So booing and hissing and forks and torches and stuff. Then I reached under the podium where I had a blender. Copy, tore it out of the column, and I showed it to them. Tore it up and put it in the blender. Then I poured a glass of water into the blender. And I drank the column. And then I held the empty bowl over my head as proof. The best publicity stunt. I got covers of magazines for making this prediction. And the principal lesson I learned, which is a lesson worth learning, people like it when you admit you're wrong. My people admired the fact I said, yeah, I was wrong. I underestimated the resilience of the network algorithms and blah, blah, blah. I groveled for a few columns. And people like that, and I've learned that. So I now admit I'm wrong a lot, which I like. I try to avoid being wrong, but as long as I'm wrong, I might as well be nice about it.
So I was looking up what you're up to, and I saw some fascinating things about geothermal exploitation and so on. So you have been changing your areas, right? Every once in a while. Do you have any advice for some of our young researchers in particular, right, about when to change?
I change columns. I change careers every 10 years or so, and I'm starting my 6th career right now. And the part of that is geothermal wells. But the whole strategy there is that there's a thing called the learning curve. You all know it's like this, and then it goes like this, and then it goes like this. And over the years, I've learned that it's no fun to be here because you don't know anything. And it's no fun to be here because you know everything. The place to be is right here on the steepest part of the learning curve. So that's my heuristic for career management is when I see that I'm on the too far or I'm stalled here, I change careers to try to stay on the middle of the learning curve. And I recommend this highly. Now, it's hard. One of my projects now is modeling a geothermal well, which I believe is the future of energy. So I'm writing a little program to simulate these wells and see what I can learn about them. And it's hard. I have to know thermodynamics. I don't know any thermodynamics. So this starting point, I now have a digression, learn thermodynamics. Then I'll go back to modeling the well. Then I'll have to learn linear algebra and matrix inversions and stuff. So I'm in a difficult period now. I'm at the beginning of entering the learning curve, and I'm struggling. Oh, excuse me. So I decided to do this model of a geothermal well, and I ran across the fact that next week Stanford is having its geothermal modeling week. Oh, I need to go to that. So I went to it last year. I ran into 200 people who have been modeling geothermal wells for 40 years. But you see my problem now. I have to find some niche. Sorry for elaborating.
No, but I guess there are theories that often biggest advances, right, come from people who are new to that field. So I'm sure you'll come up with something brilliant. So with that, let me open it up, and I'd like to, in particular, encourage the young researchers to ask their questions. And again, a lesson learned from yesterday: one question instead of two, one.
So in that curve, that n square was there. So I feel it should be S curve, like it has to be exponential and getting flatter with the number of the population of the world.
I mean, the learning curve.
No, that the curve of
Metcalfe's law, the n squared.
Metcalfe law. So
Yes.
that should be saturate over the number of population of the world, because it can't grow above certain level of even more number of population than
I wrote a
this one.
paper that said that you can't grow if you've got all the users, you can't grow anymore. So the growth rate resembles an S curve.
Yes.
You have lots of opportunity, but then you get most of them. And then I applied that to the growth of Facebook, the first 10 years of Facebook, right on. So using revenue as a surrogate for value, and then using monthly average users as a surrogate for N, well, it is N, there is an S curve, just as you were suggesting. Because you'll run out of candidates to recruit because they're all members by now.
Yeah, thank you for taking us through the journey of Ethernet. So you mentioned that you are starting your 6th career now. So can you tell us, like, for the other 5 careers, like how they panned out, or did you didn't like any of those?
I love them all. See, I don't count, I was a student for 23 years, but I don't count that. You shouldn't count that. So then I started out as an engineer, scientist, and invented Ethernet. So that worked out. And then I became an entrepreneur and founded 3Com Corporation, which eventually had a peak value of $70 billion. Inflation adjusted. So that had a good outcome. And then I became a journalist writing for InfoWorld, and I ended up with 1 million readers a week worldwide. So that worked out, except for that collapse thing that I did, the collapse of the internet. But by the way, on Thursday night, you have to decide whether you're going to be interesting or not. So the journalists have this constant temptation to wander from the truth in order to be interesting. And that was a case. That was my case right there. How many was that?
Three.
Oh, I was a venture capitalist for 10 years at Polaris. And then I became a professor at the University of Texas, professor of innovation. Did that for 12 years. And now I am becoming a computational engineer.
Thank you.
And you all know the difference between a computational engineer and a computer engineer. The computers are good enough. I don't need to work on improving them. We need to work on solving big problems. Incidentally, this modeling and simulation stuff that I'm picking up now, there's 2 kinds of practice I've discovered. One is optimization. In fact, most modelers are optimizing. But that's not what I want to do. I want to discover. So I want to model in order to discover mechanisms and things, not optimize through optimization. So that makes it even harder. So in the case of Ethernet, there was a discovery. I was simulating the operation of an Ethernet, and I made a discovery and put it into it's part of Ethernet today. And the discovery was back off. When you have a lot of congestion, the math tells you the smartest thing is not to try harder. The smartest thing is to back off. And that was not an optimization. That was a discovery.
My question is that Xerox made such wonderful innovations, but other companies made money out of it, right? And so what was it that was, well, it's easy to blame the management saying that they did not have vision or something, or what would be your advice to organizations who are great with innovations, but who might actually miss the boat? Yesterday, Jeff also mentioned about that internal version of GPT, which was there, which we're using, but Google was very hesitant to bring it out because it was not factual.
The answer to your question is the same as the answer to an earlier question. Xerox was a monopoly. And when and by the way, my colleagues, I see, like to use the pronoun they, referring to management. I keep pointing out to them, it was us. We were there doing this. But Xerox was a monopoly, so we go wading into the computer field with our fancy stuff, and it didn't fly. We got outcompeted. So Steve Jobs walks through Xerox and he says, hey, that bitmap's cool. That mouse is cool. The fonts are cool, but they're too expensive. So, and the Ethernet's 10 megabits per second. Who needs that? Let's run at 40 kilobits per second. So he was an example of somebody who took those ideas and made them adequate so they would sell.
But if it's a monopoly, how come that they invested so much on other things which were not related to the copier, right? The fonts, the things that you mentioned, right? So that is a great thing at an organization level, but they seem to have missed out to capitalize it, right?
Hi, thanks for the inspiring talk. So, in your viewpoint, has there been any fundamental change in what engineering was 50 years ago and what it is right now? How the meaning of the word engineering or how it has evolved over the past 50, 60 years?
When my company went public in 1984, we raised $11 million. When I say that to people who are currently in the Valley growing companies, they laugh. $11 million barely pays the legal fees for going public. And so what was different was the size of the market and the kind of person that you needed in order to succeed. So the engineers and associated people in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s are different from the ones today because the market's so much bigger. And so the volumes of everything are larger, and the penetration of the software into economic activity is much deeper. And so the kinds of people who succeed in Silicon Valley, for example, are different from the ones who used to succeed. Bob Noyce founded Intel. I bet in 1968 maybe. But if he founded Intel now, Bob Noyce would not have succeeded, I think. Who is succeeding? Jensen's succeeding. You know who Jensen is, right?
NVIDIA.
So he's succeeding. By the way, Jensen, I met with Jensen recently. You know about Jensen? He's currently the coolest guy on earth. And he thought he was going to do a podcast of me, but he didn't know that I love interviewing people. I interviewed him. And I discovered that he used to come to Xerox PARC and he had rapport with the security guard. And he would come and chat with the security. Now, we had a special security guard, but he got his, now I'm exaggerating, but he got his start with the security guard in the back entrance of Xerox PARC. Anyway, but he's different from Bob Noyce. He founded a different kind of semiconductor company with different numbers. The scale up of NVIDIA is astronomical compared to Intel in the 60s and 50s. And of course, the chips that I got to use are different. Oh, I learned another thing. I learned there's different kinds of engineers. There's people who are good at building one thing, and that's me. So I built one. And then we had engineers who were good at building 10. Then we had engineers who and it went all the way up to engineers who build a million a month. They're very different people. And you pay them differently, and they have different, their buzzwords are different. So there are differences along that dimension as well. There is not one thing called advice. So I couldn't possibly give advice to everybody in this room because they're different. So I'd have to find out a little bit more about you before I could give advice. But it sounds like, are you a professor or a postdoc or so my top level advice is do what you enjoy. Sounds like you enjoy engineering. So do that. The next thing is do something that pays. Don't become a sculptor. There's no market for statues, as far as I can tell. But there are, for what you do, there's a market. So in all seriousness, the way I chose to get into networking is I went to Harvard, where I was a new grad student. I said, what should be my PhD work? And they said, we have money for networking. ARPA has given us ARPANET money. And so I said, okay, I am now an ARPANET guy. And that's exactly what happened. They're mocking me. They're laughing at me. So be sure it pays. But you have to like it too. You have to like it because you can't be good at it unless you like it. And you're not going anywhere unless you're good at it.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So can you walked us through some success stories of what you've done. Can you tell us some failures that have gone through in the last 40, 50 years that you've tried, both in terms of research or in terms of products, companies that you've invested, did not work out? What did you, some stories along that?
You asked me to enumerate my failures.
Yes, of course, all of us have failures, I guess.
I have one that will appeal to most of the people in this room. I went to MIT undergraduate. I was there for 5 years.
Okay.
Got 2 bachelor's degrees, oddly. And there came time to go to grad school, and my wife had a job at MIT, so I couldn't leave. So I had to stay in Boston. So if you're going to, and then people said, well, you've been at MIT for 5 years, you should go somewhere else, get a change of scenery. And then I made a mistake, and I took their advice, and I went to Harvard for grad school. And a lot of bad stuff happened until 1972, where I submitted the draft of my thesis. Bob Taylor gave me a job at Xerox. My parents got ready to come to Harvard Yard to see their son get his PhD. And I went to my oral defense. You've never heard this before. I failed my oral defense. You know what oral defenses are like. They're like a party, and you invite the family, and then the candidate leaves the room, and then they tend to discuss you, and then you. I've done this many times. Then they come back in, and you shake hands, and you have some cake and everything. Mine didn't go that way. So I had to call. The hardest call was to my parents, of course, but then I called Bob Taylor at Xerox, who had offered me a job, and I'd accepted it, and I was due there. And Bob Taylor, remember these words, he says, well, just come here anyway, and you can finish it here. Boom. So he saved my life. Robert W. Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Other failures. Oh. So it took me another year to get my PhD.
I want to ask that. When did you finally finish?
Well, I switched advisors.
Oh, you switched advisors? And you finished in 1 year?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my new advisor comes in, Jeff, and he says, what are we going to do to get you out of here?
Good advisors to have.
1 year, yeah.
Thank you.
I know we are right on time, but maybe one last question. Yeah.
Hi. So you transitioned from being an engineer to an entrepreneur. How was that learning curve for you in terms of selling your product to the market and not just doing the engineering stuff?
So part of it was necessity. Part of it was necessity. I started this company. I had adult supervision, and the company didn't succeed right away, and we were burning cash. And we were at a phase, so my board said, let's let Bill run the company, Bob. Why don't you take over sales and marketing? And why would they give an engineer sales and marketing? Why? Well, they were desperate. That was probably one factor. But at that stage, remember I mentioned that the market was different back then. Most selling was technical. And so we all calculated that since I invented Ethernet, I could get an appointment with anybody. In the engineering process. I say, hey, and they go, oh yeah, you invented Ethernet, come on over. And then I would sell them something. There's a good rule of thumb. If you're ever stressed, sell something. And I started selling to them. And then I had to learn how to be a sales and marketing executive, and I did that. It took 2 years. And it was fun. Engineers and salespeople are different. They're both carbon life forms. But that's about the end of the similarity. The engineers used to complain, the salespeople get paid more than we do. And I'd say, come with me. I'm going on a sales trip. Come with me. And by the time I brought them back, they were done with that, and they went back to being engineers. Because selling's different from engineering. They're both very complicated.
Which one did you enjoy more?
Was that? Go ahead. What'd you say?
Which one did you enjoy more?
Can't choose. No, variety is the spice of life. So the trick is to enjoy them all.
So I will just add that we are actually all sellers. I mean, even when you're a researcher, you have to sell your work. And in fact, Bob showed us, right, during his presentation, how during selling, right, he came up with Metcalfe's law.
Thank you.
Okay.